Part of the reason I feel so confident that this is something they're doing is because this is kind of a continuation of a theme that's been present in Star Trek already up to this point. The themes of natural empathy and compassion. They're related, but not quite the same. I'm kind of putting them together a little bit. But in TOS, the themes of natural empathy and compassion as a superpower or as something that redeems that which could be very destructive in society or humanity. Particularly, I noticed this theme in a lot of the opening episodes of TOS, which I just made a bunch of videos on, so that's why it's kind of fresh and I noticed it. But for example, in Where No Man Has Gone Before, the difference between goodness and evil, when you had Gary Mitchell and the whole evil God kind of thing, the episode makes a point that a big part of the difference between goodness and evil seems to kind of boil down to compassion. Gary Mitchell has no compassion for those who are weaker than him, which is identified as part of what makes him evil. And then specifically, feminine empathy is drawn out in stylized form in the TOS Season 3 episode, The Empath, which I mentioned a little bit ago, in which Kirk and friends are trapped in this large, dark, underground alien prison where they meet a fellow prisoner who is a telepathic alien with supernatural empathic powers that include the ability to heal with a touch. So symbolically, that episode seems to me to be fantasizing about empathy as something magical and mysterious, mysteriously supernatural and life-giving. And it's doing, the episode is doing that particularly through feminine empathy, partly, I think, probably because feminine empathy is the version of empathy that's most likely to emerge by itself if no one's trying to be intentional about it. So in a story context like Star Trek, where we're kind of mythologizing or doing a fantasy reframe of things, the feminine form of empathy would be natural to be chosen for this magical supernatural form, partly because that's the form that is more likely to emerge naturally within a culture that doesn't value empathy. And looking at it poetically, you could say it may seem to emerge as though by magic. And maybe the person that you would see showing that empathy might be your sexual partner. And then it makes perfect sense for you to, in your story, in your poetry, to put them together. That a woman in a sexual context has the magical power of empathic healing. Anyway, so that episode, The Empath, it's been a while since I saw that episode, but when I did see it, this was several years back, but I remember thinking that I thought the concepts were really fun. I wasn't sure if the presentation worked as well, particularly because of how they portrayed the alien by means of a mime, and they didn't particularly focus or do a particularly interesting job portraying actual empathy, for example, on her face. But from the writing and the concept point of view, I think that was the beginning of this theme of supernatural empathy in Star Trek, if we distinguish that from the different compassion references that I talked about in the early episodes. And it seems that some of the most interesting parts of the concept behind Ilea's character as well were kind of lifted straight out of that story, which I think suggests that some of the creators who put that in there saw empathy, they saw these empathy themes as being not just important enough and big enough and beautiful enough for a one-off episode mid the original Star Trek, but they saw it as being a good enough and a big enough and a beautiful enough topic to become central to this new series they were developing, it would seem. I think really, even though they shaved Ilea's head, I think her highly expressive face is one of the high points and most visually beautiful parts of this entire film. I think the actress does such a really compelling job maintaining her role as a highly emotionally attuned alien throughout this film. And I think this is especially, it becomes important where in the later parts of the film, they replace her with the robotic V'ger probe, in which all of these qualities are eliminated, and we as viewers are supposed to be struck by the tragic contrast. And then it's suggested in dialogue that these humanistic qualities may periodically seep through in unexpected ways, even in the robotic V'ger probe. And then when it does that, it's going to be made all the more visible to us because we no longer assume them. They're no longer expected. So thinking about these themes going on toward the next generation, this concept of supernatural empathy then, of course, continues with Counselor Troi, who is a professional counselor because that's kind of a natural fit with her superpower. In that sense, Troi is sort of a mix between Ilea here, mixed with Lieutenant Commander Denner from the alt pilot episode Where No Man Has Gone Before. Because Denner, if you remember, had psychic powers that caused her to be inclined toward becoming a psychiatrist. Presumably that's the context for Troi's vocational decision as well. Her psychic powers kind of made that a natural fit. So if you mix the concept of Denner with the concept of Ilea, what you end up with is Troi. Unfortunately, in the early seasons of TNG, either the acting or the directing or both for Troi didn't come out in a way that ended up portraying, as I remember watching it last time I watched it, didn't end up really portraying actual empathy or emotional attunement, anything nearly as authentically or convincingly as what is presented in the Ilea character in this film. Though definitely Troi's portrayals get much better later on, especially from what I remember when she shows up in Voyager and the cameos there, and in Star Trek Picard, where they become much more authentic and fun to watch. Now, meanwhile, empathy doesn't disappear, but continues to be a theme in Star Trek, and especially to be exemplified by key characters. So, in The Next Generation, Guinan is a bit of a stone face and doesn't have any telepathic powers as far as we know, but she has an uncanny ability to read people. And you could suggest she's the true empathic counselor of the Enterprise. Going on to DS9, Bashir develops a really tangible and absolutely compelling natural empathy and warmth in the latter half of the series, and you especially see this in episodes like The Quickening and episodes like Hard Time, the season 4 episode in which O'Brien tries to kill himself, and then Bashir finds him and really tenderly, passionately intervenes. In Voyager, Kes is a consistent and exquisite portrayal of natural empathy, and in many scenes, she seems to be kind of the counselor of Voyager in the same way that Guinan was in TNG. Though in universe, this is kind of unfortunately a bit at odds with the fact that she's actually supposed to have only been alive for 2 years. Whereas when you hear her discussing things with the Doctor, it's almost like the framing almost feels like she's this ancient being, kind of like Guinan. But we just kind of have to overlook that fact to enjoy the Kes character. Incidentally, as a naturally empathic character, Kes also later on turns out to have psychic powers as well. Probably an unintentional thing the creators did. They seem to have, without knowing it, followed this Star Trek trend that associates empathy together with ESP as going together. Moving on to Enterprise, Captain Archer is a leader who I think really prioritizes emotional intelligence, and I think his empathic sensitivity is really seen especially in the early seasons in an episode like, for example, Fight or Flight, with his interactions with Hoshi there. Janeway and Sisko also have some really good father moments or mother moments that have a similar tone, but Archer's presentation stands out because it's built into his leadership style. It shows up in the kinds of moments where you might expect other captains to adopt more of the strong leader type of persona. But for Archer, it seems like it's not just in his father moments, quote unquote, or Janeway's mother moments, but for Archer, it's actually kind of baked into the core of his leadership style in the place of the more heavy or strong leadership style. Or at least that's the case until season 3, where he kind of goes all Captain Ahab, but that's another story. Anyway, so then if we had, Guinan for TNG, we had Bashir, and then we have Kes in Voyager, Archer in Enterprise. And then once you get to Star Trek Picard, the elderly Picard is just dripping with warmth and empathy, kind of like Archer on steroids. And I think that's really a reflection of how American values have kind of changed between the beginning of Star Trek in the late 60s and now when Picard came out. Or Picard came out several years back, but you know what I'm saying. In early Star Trek, the TOS type era, compassion and empathy were things that were talked about in kind of a hypothetical, distant kind of way, as some kind of mystical ideal that no one really understood. And that's why, I suppose, they had a whole episode about empathy in TOS, the empath, but the portrayal, to be honest, was kind of cringe, because this was something that they knew was a thing called empathy, and they knew this is something that may solve a lot of bad things in the world. This is something that we value, we want more of in the world, we want to idealize metaphorically in our story, but it wasn't popular or well understood enough in the world at the time for the team working on the show to actually have the experience to know how to actually get it portrayed on screen effectively. So it's kind of like it was, or at least this is my guess. Like I wasn't alive in the late 60s or the 70s, but it seems to me that it was kind of like, at least for the Star Trek people, this was kind of a newly emerging ideal that was valued, but most people didn't necessarily have a lot of knowledge or experience with. But by contrast, when you get to Picard, this is just part of our culture. Our culture is very focused on emotional intelligence and sensitivity and things like that. It's assumed, and for a hero to be really likable and to really be admired by a broad audience, he's going to have empathy and emotional intelligence in spades, like Picard in season 1 of Picard. And then if you want to add Discovery, if you want to include Discovery into it, for Discovery, it would be Admiral Cornwell. Burnham is clearly supposed to be portraying an empathic character in terms of the way the story is set up and the way but in my opinion, that aspect of her character fails in terms of the portrayal. It kind of comes across as really pretentious. But Admiral Cornwell, on the other hand, For me at least, now it's been a long time since I've seen Discovery. I actually haven't finished Discovery because I'm not a huge Discovery fan. But what I remember of Admiral Cornwell is I remember seeing her and thinking that she was really just a really exquisite and fun to watch portrayal of a really emotionally intelligent, empathic character. Though that being said, it's been a while since I've seen any Discovery and I haven't finished it. All right, so that was my detour on empathy. I do think the topic of empathy in Star Trek is a fascinating and really fun topic to explore, so it's hard for me to resist going down that rabbit hole. But let's get back to 1979. So, Ilia appears in the turbo lift, everybody's head turns. Decker immediately greets her, and then she lights the